Mark Short has been in close contact with Vice President Pence. I mean, they are always with each other. Short is now positive for the virus.
That's correct.
So CDC guidelines say that Vice President Pence should quarantine for 14 days. Now, I understand the White House is trying to get around that by saying the vice president is an essential worker. But, Mark, how is going all over the country, how is that campaigning? How is that essential work? It's not like he's helping to contain the virus. In fact, the opposite. He's holding rallies that could be spreading the virus.
Well, actually, he's not just campaigning, he's working. We saw a Middle East peace agreement with Sudan in the Oval Office that the president engaged in. And for anybody to suggest that the president has been out campaigning and not getting things done, all you have to do is look at the facts.
He was at a campaign rally in Tallahassee. He was just in a campaign rally in Tallahassee.
I'm not saying he's not campaigning. I'm saying that that is only part of what he's doing. And as we look at that, essential personnel, whether it's the vice president of the United States or anyone else,
but he's not
has to continue
following
on.
CDC guidelines.
Well, no, Jake, CDC guidelines does say essential personnel.
Yes, it says wear a mask. If they wear a mask.
And I spoke to the vice president last night at midnight, and I can tell you that what he's doing is wearing a mask, socially distancing, and when he goes up to speak, he will take the mask off, put it back on. But he's wearing a mask as it relates to this particular thing because the doctors have advised him to do that. And so, Jake, when we start to look at this, you know, here's where we really need to make sure. On your website yesterday, Jake, your website is talking about, well, now we think the spread is coming from small social groups and family groups. First it was large groups. Now it's small groups.
It's
now
coming from all sorts of places.
Well,
that's exactly, from all sorts of places because the pandemic's out of control.
So here's what we have to do. We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation areas.
Why aren't we going to get control of the pandemic?
Because it is a contagious virus, just like the flu.
Yeah, but why not make efforts to contain it?
Well, we are making efforts to contain it.
By running all over the country, not wearing a mask?
Jake,
that's what the vice president's doing.
We can get into the back and forth. Let me just say this. Is what we need to do is make sure that we have the proper mitigation factors, whether it's therapies or vaccines or treatments, to make sure that people don't die from this. But to suggest that we're going to actually quarantine all of America, lock down our economy.
No one's saying that.
Well, they are. Joe Biden's saying that. He says lock everybody down. We're going to have a dark winter. We're going to have a dark winter.
That's what health officials say. That's what health officials say, that it's going to get worse.
No,
we have the
Joe Biden's
worst days.
Jake,
let's be honest. Infections, Friday and Saturday.
Let's be honest here. The health officials did not say dark winter. Those were Joe Biden's words.
He was quoting a health official. I think he was quoting William Haseltine.
When we look at the number of cases increasing, what we have to do is make sure that we fight it with therapeutics and vaccines, take proper mitigation factors in terms of social distancing and masks when we can. And when we look at this, we're going to defeat it, Jake, because we're Americans. We do that. And this president is leading while Joe Biden is sitting there suggesting that we're going to mandate masks.
What this is Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, effectively admitting that the administration is waving the white flag when it comes to containing this virus. Why? Because according to Meadows, it's a contagious virus. Quite the pivot from Obama's slogan of yes, we can to Trump's new slogan of sorry, we can't. This came in the aftermath of the news that a staggering 5 members of Mike Pence's staff have now tested positive for coronavirus, including his chief of staff, Mark Short, and his body man, Zach Bauer, a personal aide who spends his days at Pence's side. And this is just the latest spate of positive infections, just weeks after positive infections from Trump and Melania and their son Barron, Kellyanne Conway, Kayleigh McEnany and most of the press shop, campaign manager Bill Stepien and Trump's personal assistant Nick Luna, Chris Christie, Stephen Miller, Senators Ron Johnson, Mike Lee, Tom Tillis. The point being that Republicans have been so reckless when it comes to this virus that they themselves have become monuments to their own failure to contain it. And yet, despite these 5 infections from those surrounding the vice president, still Pence has opted to continue campaigning. This is the head of the coronavirus task force. And instead of quarantining for 14 days in accordance with CDC guidelines after being in close contact with those who've tested positive, Pence has opted to continue hosting rallies, the literal least safe thing he could do if indeed he does have coronavirus. So not only was this administration responsible for allowing the virus to explode uncontained throughout the country, but now administration members themselves may very well be personally spreading it to their own supporters. But Pence's own horrific leadership aside, what's even more damning here is Meadows admitting that this administration is no longer even pretending to take efforts to contain the virus. Instead, they're focused on simply waiting for a vaccine. Why? Because it's easy, because they don't have to do anything, because they just have to wait for pharmaceutical companies to finish their trials. The fact is that this administration was never interested in doing any of the work to contain the virus. They never bothered to coordinate a nationwide testing or contact tracing system. They never bothered to encourage mask mandates, instead allowing Trump to politicize the use of masks. They never bothered to advocate for stay-at-home orders, instead sitting idly by as Trump fomented protests against stay-at-home orders, leading to even bigger spikes as a result of those gatherings. So no, this White House was never interested in putting in any of the work necessary to keep people safe. The only difference now is that they're apparently not even pretending to care anymore. Meadows even says that our priority should be therapies or vaccines or treatments so that people don't die, which I must say is probably going to be welcome news to those 220,000 families who've already lost loved ones. You know what would have been more effective than this retroactive approach of just trying to make sure people don't die once they've already contracted the virus? Making sure people don't get the virus in the first place. Had this administration had even an ounce of foresight and taken care of this problem when they had the chance, they wouldn't have to implement a strategy of just trying to stave off as many deaths as possible. This is not an effective strategy. It is the single worst strategy possible. It is a lazy, retroactive approach from an administration that never bothered to take preventative measures and is now seeing the consequences of that. And finally, perhaps the most disingenuous part of all, after spewing an entire interview's worth of bad faith talking points, Mark Meadows falls back on some good old-fashioned platitudes, claiming that we're going to defeat this because we're Americans. And there's no way the virus is going to want to get in the ring with us Americans because we've got freedom and liberty and small government and resolve. I mean, give me a break. The virus doesn't care about patriotism. The virus doesn't care about your buzzwords. The virus is an airborne pathogen that infects people who don't take proper measures to protect themselves, like, oh, I don't know, attending rallies and not wearing masks and being around other infected people, all things that this very White House is perpetuating. This administration is quite literally creating the conditions that they're pretending to want to fight against. The fact is that people like Mark Meadows will do the cable news circuit to try and obfuscate the facts and muddy the waters and pretend like we've seen competent leadership out of this White House, but the numbers speak for themselves. We have 220,000 deaths in this country. We're losing 1,000 Americans a day. The last 2 days alone have been the worst ever in terms of new cases. And yet still they have no plan. They would rather spend their time pushing through Supreme Court justices to take healthcare away from people during this pandemic. They would rather show up on Fox News and crow about Hunter Biden's phony email scandal on primetime every night. All because they don't care about Americans dying, they just care about trying to get reelected. So with polls now open, if you haven't voted, or if you're on the fence about voting, or if you're considering voting for Trump, listen to what these White House officials are telling you. They want you to know that they're not willing to do the work necessary to keep you safe. And if they won't do it now, with an election upon us, with them on their best behavior, just imagine how little they'll care if they get reelected. Just imagine how terrible it'll be when they're no longer accountable to the American people at the ballot box. So if you want to protect yourself and your family and your community, then you have only one option: to cast a ballot for Joe Biden and elect a president who cares about your life more than his own political future. If you like this video, please check out my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, where I take a deep dive into the week's most important stories and interview major players in politics, including Kamala Harris, Katie Porter, Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Eric Swalwell, Mary Trump, Al Franken, Cory Booker, and many, many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.